100 years ago, the conservation movement took flight, and not a minute too soon. By 1900, Americans' belief that our continent's wildlife was inexhaustible had led to serious consequences. Bison no longer roamed the Great Plains, and passenger pigeons that had once darkened the skies for miles as they passed overhead had been exterminated. Many other species were on the brink. Overhunting and habitat destruction were key factors. But in the case of birds, something else was also at work. A new fashion had swept the nation. Bird hats were all the rage. One day, while walking in Manhattan, Frank Chapman, publisher of Bird Lore magazine, counted 542 people wearing hats adorned with either entire birds or their plumage, representing a total of 42 bird species. Egrets, in particular, were so highly prized that their feathers were worth twice their weight in gold. No wonder that plume hunters were slaughtering them. But through the bold efforts of some far-sighted Americans, these magnificent creatures and many more were saved, just in time. These people founded one of America's longest-lived and most successful conservation organizations, the National Audubon Society. Early bird conservation meant waging battles on two fronts. On one, influential citizens persuaded their friends not to create demand for bird plumes. On the supply front, the struggle turned deadly. In Florida, the epicenter of the plumage trade, Audubon hired wardens to protect vital bird nesting sites. Guy Bradley was one of these wardens. He himself had been a plume hunter, but had come to believe the decimation had to stop. On confronting a poacher he knew, Bradley was shot and killed and left to drift in his boat. Over the next 3 years, 2 more Audubon wardens would be shot and killed in the line of duty. Their deaths became the rallying cry for conservationists across the country. One of them was President Theodore Roosevelt. An ardent conservationist and ornithologist, Roosevelt understood that natural areas and wildlife were in danger unless protected. And so he created the nation's first wildlife refuge, Florida's Pelican Island, in 1903, followed by 5 of our national parks, 51 bird preserves, and 150 national forests. He also became an honorary vice president of the Audubon Society, which was, in turn, motivated by his passion and his pragmatism. The 1940s were a pivotal decade for the Society. The organization's educational efforts were enhanced first by the introduction of the Audubon Screen Tours. These short films traveled to dozens of American cities, introducing urban dwellers to the wonders of nature. Then, in 1943, the first Audubon Center opened in Greenwich, Connecticut. The concept of connecting people with nature through community-based centers took flight from here. It grew into today's network of Audubon centers spread across the country. During this period, Audubon Vice President Carl Buckheister encouraged local bird clubs around the nation to become branches of the larger organization as local Audubon chapters. In doing so, these chapters strengthened the organization's backbone. Today, Audubon chapters number close to 500. In the 1950s, Junior Audubon was joined by Audubon bulletins and study aids in the nation's classrooms. More kids were growing up with Audubon than ever before. Education was important because the new environmental threats weren't so easily seen, at least not at first. The post-war boom brought Americans prosperity and convenience as never before. New chemicals like DDT and malathion promised more effective pest control and productive agriculture. But these promises came with hidden costs. Just as canaries had saved countless miners in past centuries from poison gases, once again, birds alerted us with early warning signs. As these pesticides worked their way up the food chain, raptor populations plummeted. Audubon scientists were on the case. As early as 1945, Audubon magazine had warned that pesticides' indiscriminate use would ultimately threaten far more than their intended targets. Then, in 1960, Audubon research director Alex Sprunt launched the Continental Bald Eagle Project. His studies helped clarify the connection between increased pesticides in the environment and declining raptor populations. As a fellow scientist, Rachel Carson knew the time had come to sound the alarm. And in 1962, she published her watershed Silent Spring. In warning about an impending ecological collapse, the book created an uproar. While scientists knew she was right, many others castigated her findings. But nature had the final say. No sooner had Silent Spring been released than even casual observers couldn't help but see danger signs everywhere. Pumped full of pollutants, Lake Erie sprouted massive algae blooms that suffocated the very life out of it. One of its tributaries was so polluted it actually caught fire, and the nation's attention. Elsewhere, coastal communities suffered hepatitis outbreaks from contaminated beaches. America's skies were increasingly choked with smog. Bird and wildlife populations continued their decline. Americans could see they had to act before it was too late. Audubon rallied its vast grassroots network of concerned citizens, together with a new office in Washington, D.C. Along with other environmental organizations, broad popular support, and the signature of President Richard Nixon, Audubon helped to enact some of the globe's most far-reaching conservation. Then came the first signs of success, as our rivers and skies gradually cleared. Populations of bald eagles, peregrine falcons, brown pelicans, roseate spoonbills began to rebound. Americans had seen the need for environmental protection, and Audubon as never before. The organization's membership grew more than threefold in the years from 1968 to 1978. The rugged individualism of Audubon's founders was kept alive. In 1973, Audubon biologist Stephen Kress began to return Atlantic puffins to the islands off the coast of Maine, where they hadn't been seen for 100 years. He and his volunteers succeeded wildly. 30 years later, Project Puffin has helped establish over 600 breeding pairs of puffins there. The threat of extinction still loomed for other species, like the condor. Audubon biologists captured the last wild condor in 1987. After placing him in a captive breeding program for 15 years, he, along with 40 others, were released back into the wild. Today, they number 247 and growing. On a larger scale, the 1980s saw Audubon gain support for the passage of the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, which created the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And in 1996, hearkening back to where it began, the Everglades Restoration Act was passed, promising to restore this one-of-a-kind ecosystem. 100 years ago, a dedicated group of Americans came together out of their love for birds and nature and their desire to protect them both. As Audubon enters its second century, the conservation challenges we face are no less urgent. But Audubon's mission to protect birds, wildlife, and their habitat remains just as vital today as it did a century ago. Birds are a crucial link in the chain of life. Protecting them is to ultimately protect our own quality of life. Today, Audubon is reaching out to new, diverse audiences with the information and tools with which we can act. Each one of us can make a conservation difference. That is the Audubon legacy. With your help, we will make it happen for another century.